Hey folks, thanks for watching. This is going to be a busy video. There's a lot I want to cover in this, namely the heat wave that's unfolding over the middle part of the country. And then near the end of the video, I'm going to add, I think what I'm going to call some healthy skepticism to some of the dynamical model forecasts for August. So kind of thinking about where we're going in August, segueing off of Eric's August outlook, I'm going to identify some regions that maybe those models are overlooking a little bit. We've seen them perform poorly this year, so I'm in kind of a like prove it to me mode as a forecaster here with some of the uncertainty in those long range forecasts, at least from a few of those. So we'll look at that at the end of this video. We'll touch on the tropics and the MJO, obviously, in that discussion. But in the meantime, regardless of where we're going in August, we have heat unfolding this week. And the reason for that is clear. Just looking at the 500 millibar jet stream level winds here this morning, that's what's displayed on the screen. If you just look over much of the continental US, we have this clockwise flow generally. And then if you ask me where's the center of that, I would say it's about over Houston this morning. See, that's the center of that clockwise flow. Now, this is pulling up some moist air into New Mexico in the southwest. We're seeing flood watches persisting here this morning, but namely it's the heat. As this ridge expands in influence over today, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday especially, those kind of oppressive mid-July temperatures, elevated humidity, very warm overnight temperatures will be expanding quickly into the Corn Belt over an area that's widely tasseled at this point, at least with respect to corn. If you look over the last roughly 18 hours, just through a radar mosaic here, eyeing two areas. One, we saw a decent thunderstorm complex move through south central Kansas, almost a bow echo here. And then Montana, looking into the Dakotas, we saw some thunderstorms move overnight. Eric mentioned the potential for continued bow echoes, and we can see that kind of morphology, if you will, take shape both in Kansas and the Dakotas overnight last night, even some of these persisting here this morning. See some spotty showers and storms over the southeast and then the northwest. Include Montana in that, but central and eastern Washington, eastern Oregon getting good precipitation coverage yesterday. This has been an area that's gone over dry this summer, so it's good to see precipitation. But also, there's a trough on the west side of that big ridge I talked about, bringing some cooler temperatures to the western U.S., which has seen very hot temperatures at times this year, but also these kind of swings, warm to cool to warm to cool again, and that's continued here at the end of July. We did see some severe reports yesterday associated with that line of storms in south central Kansas, and then lesser so on those storms across the northern tier of the country, a few over in Utah as well. I did mention the tropics. We'll talk about that at the end of the video, but we did have one wave that we've been keeping an eye on here early this week. We highlighted the potential for a weak system we might have to keep an eye on moving east to west across the Atlantic. And while we can see some bubbling thunderstorms associated with this is just east of the Lesser Antilles at this point. The National Hurricane Center has identified this as having, at least here this morning, a big fat 0% chance of developing over the next 7 days. So not a major concern right now. Just generally across the Atlantic, don't see a very favorable kind of background state for tropical development and thunderstorms. You can just kind of see that, even beyond the system. There's really no other, obvious thunderstorm development. So it's unfavorable right now for development. That could change in August. We'll discuss that this week. And it's still something we'll have to keep an eye on. As we get into the middle part and the late part of next month, that's kind of, we start reaching that peak of the hurricane season. If we look over the last 24 hours of precipitation, this is radar derived. Look at Kansas, portions of Missouri. Heavier rainfall coverage in this area, and then that swathy precipitation coverage across the Dakotas. Some of these counties missing out here across Minnesota, but decent coverage in here. And portions of central Minnesota over into the Canadian Prairie and Montana, eastern Oregon. Again, an area that has been dry this year, getting at least some precipitation here, maybe in the half-inch range. I did want to discuss those heat advisories. Those have been posted all the way from central South Dakota, stretching all the way down toward the northern part of the Florida Peninsula here. So a wide area of heat advisories has been issued. We'll probably see some more of these kind of filter into some of these counties here, particularly over in the eastern Corn Belt. What you see in this kind of white contour, those are extreme heat warnings. So that oppressive, unfortunately, mid to late July heat is on its way for cities like Chicago, down toward Springfield, Illinois, and then all the way down the Mississippi, in the lower Mississippi River Valley. We do see some flood watches posted here for New Mexico. I mentioned that ridge parked here over Houston, that flow coming up like this, that's bringing some of that warm, moist Atlantic air over toward the southwest, and here over the northern tier of Minnesota and Wisconsin, with some of those thunderstorms still persisting here this morning. Now, on the periphery of this ridge, Eric talked about this, expecting more of that kind of bow echo-like development, and that will continue here today. Southeastern Montana stretching all the way again through Minnesota, far western Wisconsin. Tomorrow on Wednesday, that activity shifts a little bit to the south and east, so over the northern part of Wisconsin, southern and south central Minnesota, northwest Iowa, eastern Nebraska. Expecting wind reports to continue over these corridors here, and that kind of paints the periphery of the worst of the heat. And you can see this even on Thursday, continuing over northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and Michigan with this marginal risk here from the SPC. So each day I can kind of draw the periphery of that ridge. You can imagine the worst of the heat is going to be underneath that, each day. So maybe shifting a little bit to the east as we go through this week over the next 72 hours. I did want to highlight one area in here. This is LaSalle County, Illinois. So this is the north central part of the state of Illinois. It has been one area we've mentioned over and over again this year in kind of this I-80 corridor where they were drier this year. And you can see that in their year-to-date accumulated precipitation. Now, while they have been drier, they've still had these little, do you see these little stair steps in here? I mean, these have been valuable rains to keep us from, plateauing in some of these acres across the country. And we're actually seeing this kind of same behavior elsewhere across the Corn Belt. Now, fortunately, that story has improved a bit here in July with more proper precipitation amounts coming through over the last 2 weeks. But I was kind of surprised when I jumped over and looked at the historical temperatures for the same county here, again near LaSalle, Peru, Illinois, that we have seen that heat. We saw the heat wave that originally built in into late June. So we flipped the calendar to July. We've staved off kind of the worst of that daytime heat, but we've still been elevated in a number of days here in July. And what we're looking at here are not maximum temperatures, because we've obviously been over 90 degrees Fahrenheit in north central Illinois at times this year, but these are average daily temperatures, so an average between that high and that low. And it does showcase that over the last kind of 20 to 30 days, we've seen these elevated overnight temperatures in parts of the Corn Belt, and this map's going to continue with that heat building in with that heat wave here. So there are some areas that are dry in the Corn Belt, despite overall pretty largely favorable conditions that have been observed, that are going to be accumulating some stress here. I think over the next 10 days or so. It's something we have to remember. Now, the reason for that, I think pretty obvious. It's showcased here looking at the National Weather Service high temperature forecast. This is here today, Tuesday. So there's warmer temperatures settling in even here today as that ridge takes hold. 100-degree Fahrenheit forecast for Memphis and Little Rock, 90s and upper 90s stretching down through the southeast, and then up into the western Corn Belt, looking at 80s and low 90s. Nebraska looking at high 90s here today. Eastern Corn Belt kind of waiting for further in the week. I mentioned those Storm Prediction Center risks areas are kind of shifting southeast each day, and that tells us that heat's probably going to be pushing in further to the east along with that. So if I take this into Wednesday, see this heat shifting more so over the middle part of the country, now getting into the Ohio River Valley, and some reprieve coming from the northern plains, and we can see the west staying cooler here this week. So take this forecast into Thursday. Now looking at 100-degree temperatures from Austin, Texas, looking at mid to high 90s through Tennessee, and then low 90s up into New England, Michigan, mid 90s here over Indiana and Illinois. You can see the urban heat island effect near Chicago with high temperatures near 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 98 in St. Louis. Cooler in the western Corn Belt now, and the Plains states still cooler out west at this point. So we get into Friday, seeing a little bit of a moderation of those temperatures here, maybe over the middle part of the country, the Midwest. Saturday continuing. I mean, these are still warm July temperatures, but not that same kind of oppressive heat. But even by Sunday, seeing this start to recharge a bit over a very wide area now. 100-degree Fahrenheit forecast for Kansas, low to mid 90s across portions of Illinois and Missouri. High 80s, low 90s across the eastern Corn Belt, the Ohio River Valley, getting into the low 90s here now in the Carolinas. We know a wide area of the country as we get through the weekend, seeing that July heat, that continuing on Monday as well. So kind of a brief moderation of this heat over the weekend with some precipitation chances that are going to sneak through as well, but generally a kind of a re-intensification of this heat wave over even a broader area into early next week. Now, the reason for that kind of, let's call it that brief kind of weekend reprieve, if I show you the 500 millibar height forecast. This is from the ECMWF here. I'm going to take this quickly into Wednesday and then Thursday, 7 p.m. on Thursday. You can see this ridge has shifted from maybe a Houston ridge. It shifted kind of over here. It's sort of nebulous, maybe here over New Jersey, Indiana, Ohio. We saw that heat shifting to the east and that SPC risk area for thunderstorms shifting over this corridor as well. And we're seeing these kind of little kind of shortwave troughs trying to sneak through here. It's not obvious on the 500 millibar height forecast, but there are some of these little troughs trying to sneak through on Thursday and Friday. And we're going to see precipitation chances over this corridor here. They're not going to be widespread because we're still kind of in this more dominant ridge regime, But that is something we'll be able to look forward to on Friday and then Saturday as well across portions of the Midwest and the upper Midwest. Let's take this forecast through the weekend. See that troughing staying in lock hold out west. And then by Sunday, notice that ridge that did kind of weaken and shift to the east, maybe near New Jersey and Ohio, has shifted back toward the west. Near maybe Kansas City, the middle part of the state of Missouri here. That's really where the anchor of that ridge is now. By Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday just continues over this area here with the heat rebuilding back into a wide area of the country. Now you notice by Tuesday and then Wednesday evening, getting out for basically a week from now at this point, the anchor of that ridge starting to shift to the west. You can see this more broad northwest Canadian ridge setting up. And this is going to allow us by Wednesday to get some cooler temperatures back into this part of the country, maybe even getting back into the plains as the worst of that heat shifts further to the west. So looking at maybe a break from some of the extreme heat as we get out into the middle part of next week for this corridor here, maybe even inching a little bit further west with a break from those warm temperatures. Now I mentioned that kind of weakness in the ridging and then shifting to the east. This is looking at 500 millibar vorticity from the ECMWF forecast, that same forecast that we just looked at. But the reason I'm showing it is as that ridge, see it moving east as we go through Thursday, as I mentioned, over toward New Jersey, there's these little shortwave troughs moving through. Here's one over North Dakota, one here over Kansas. Just go through Thursday and then Friday. Look at that there, right along I-80, essentially right over LaSalle County here. This is Friday evening. There'll be precipitation chances associated with these. You can see another one here over Minnesota. Those push through over the weekend, and then another one on Monday coming through Wisconsin. But that ridge, even by Monday, redeveloping over the middle part of the country, the heat's going to be returning in a big way. As I take that forecast out to Thursday of next week, that's now the end of July. You can see that more northwest regime taking pattern over the middle part of the country, and the heat starting to push back to the west at this point. I do want to jump over and look at that ECMWF precipitation forecast quickly. I made this valid here. It's about 7 a.m., so there's those remnants, thunderstorms and showers across the northern part of the country, southern Canadian prairie. If I step this through to this evening, you can see that coverage expand across Minnesota and the Dakotas. We saw that from the Storm Prediction Center, highlighting this corridor here for severe storm development. Also, we're seeing this kind of remnant tropical moisture from that almost tropical system last week. If you think about where this ridge is expanding, kind of in this corridor here, that you can kind of follow that flow back around to from the northeast in this corridor here, and it's actually keeping some of this remnant tropical moisture kind of parked over the southeast. So you're also going to see, as I step through this forecast over the next 7 days, that this corridor here stays on the wetter side. So that took us through this evening to early Wednesday morning. If I take this through Wednesday afternoon, you can see this corridor shifting a little bit to the south, Nebraska, eastern South Dakota, northern Wisconsin, central Minnesota, even some storms back here over Wyoming and then eastern Montana. There's those storms here that I mentioned, and that remnant moisture over Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. I'm going to take the forecast now to Thursday. Let's do Thursday afternoon. See, again, shifting to the southeast a bit as the heat expands into Indiana and Ohio. Those storms shifting along the periphery of that ridge, and again, maintaining that southeast precipitation signal. If I take us into Friday evening, I mentioned that's when that shortwave's coming through kind of that I-80 corridor and seeing precipitation chances along that, potentially coming as some stronger thunderstorms as well, and continuing to see some Canadian prairie precipitation chances as we approach the weekend. And then going through the day on Saturday, additional coverage across the Midwest and then the Southeast. I mentioned that. Again, those short waves moving through. And then by Sunday, you can see some activity here across the northern tier of the country, just some weak showers here perhaps in the eastern part of the country. And then by Monday, that's when that ridge is shifting back, re-entrenching over a wide area of the country. Remember, we saw Sunday and Monday, the heat really expanding. So seeing naturally precipitation chances weaken. It's not going to be zero across this whole corridor, but obviously not as much precipitation, just widespread on Tuesday and then Wednesday. Now, I will say Wednesday evening and then getting into Thursday, with this ridge kind of re-intensifying over the northwest, starting to see better chances for rain push into this area here, which is going to be critical. So we just look at the ECMWF forecast over the next 7 days. Look at Oklahoma, Arkansas, southern Missouri, Texas. And this is a corridor where we're expecting very warm temperatures. You can almost stretch this over into the Tennessee Valley, where not a lot of rainfall expected, but with some very warm temperatures. Again, eyeing this area for flash drought development at the end of July here. Go to the WPC forecast, even a little bit more stark for that corridor here, but seeing decent precipitation coverage over Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, a lot of the I-states here, even into the Carolinas, the southeast with that remnant tropical moisture. Canadian prairie, not intense 1 inch plus values, but still seeing some precip here over one of the hotter parts of the year. And again, that corridor here is where we're highlighting. Now, if I jump over and show you the last 30 days of precipitation, and we kind of compare and contrast what we're seeing here over that 7-day forecast, I'm watching this area in here because if I jump over and show you the last 30 days of precipitation, you can find some counties in here that have not lucked out in some of this kind of summertime thunderstorm regime. There are a few in here that are above average, and then there's some quarters here like northern Missouri, portions of Arkansas, western Oklahoma that are below average over the next 30 days. And you're looking at an extended stretch here with warm temperatures in this corridor here and spotty precipitation chances. So some of these areas that have been on the lower side are going to see some of these drought classifications perhaps start to sneak in over the next 10 days or so. If we do look at that temperature forecast, we're looking at this grid here. So top to bottom, this is the ECMWF ensemble. The middle is the GFS ensemble, and the bottom is the AFS forecast. Now, over the next 5 days in this forecast, this takes us out to the 26th. That warmth clear here over the eastern part of the country with that ridge kind of oscillating from Illinois toward New Jersey. So it makes sense that we're seeing all this warmth from the models here from the southeast all the way up into the middle part of the country. As we shift to the 5 to 10 day, that's kind of starting in the weekend and heading out into the next work week. We see, at least from the GFS ensemble, more expansive heat across a wider area of the country as that heat wave re-intensifies. Seeing that here also over the ECMWF ensemble with some cooler air trying to now get into the plains. The AFS has been a little bit more amplified as we get into the next work week, showing that kind of brief re-intensification of that ridge, but some cooler temperatures here over the plains. But the reason I'm showing this is because we get out to 10 to 15 days. This is the first week of August now. We're finally seeing kind of a wider reprieve from that warm temperature risk here over the plains, the Midwest, the eastern U.S., still slightly on the warmer side here over the southeast, but not nearly as anomalously warm as what we're seeing this week. And you see that also in the GFS ensemble, albeit less widespread cool chances, and then now from the AFS as well. The reason for this, again, is that ridge. We saw this on that 500 millibar height forecast, shifting more so over the northwest, even Canada at times. And the more amplified this pattern is, the AFS tends to be more amplified, right, than those ensembles, the better chance that we're going to see some of these colder temperatures. And I say colder, I mean colder relative to average for late July, early August here. And we can see that here from the 500 millibar height anomaly. This is from the ECMWF ENS. So we take this into Monday and Tuesday of next week, right? We mentioned by Sunday and Monday this ridge re-expands, but by the middle part of the week, it starts to inch toward the northwest. That's when we saw those precipitation chances move in on Wednesday, kind of this corridor here. And with that ridge expanding to the northwest, that's allowing colder air to sneak back in to the middle part of the country. So that's why we saw those colder values in that corridor here. Take the ECMWF ENS out further, it just kind of washes out into this kind of broad summertime ridge. I don't know how much of a signal from this we can take. This takes us all the way to August 4th, 5th, and 6th. I don't see a huge signal here in either direction. Again, I've had some skepticism of the long-range models here going into this year. The AFS is a little bit more amplified next week. I'm going to take this quickly, 28th, 29th, and now Wednesday, Thursday of next week, and see this ridge really, the anchor of it more so almost over Canada proper. This trough here over the Canadian Maritimes, and then generally more mild conditions underneath that here with this kind of corridor of precipitation expected through the middle part of the country. We jump over and show you the ECMWF ENS. This is the 8 to 14 day precipitation anomaly forecast. Again, that corridor from the Canadian Prairie through Missouri, northern Oklahoma, even trying to get into Arkansas. We'll be watching this precipitation coverage expand into that next week, kind of late week forecast, so July 30th through August 5th, as that heat finally abates. Looking at precipitation getting into this corridor here. Now, one area that I think we have to keep an eye on is New England. Eric mentioned this yesterday. Starting to watch this area going over dry in early August. That could be a concern because I mentioned the last 30 days of precip. I mean, you can draw kind of that I-80 drought and connect it almost through northern PA, up into New England, Maine, over toward upstate New York. I mean, there's some counties in here that are on the drier side, certainly. So watching that corridor, potentially over the next kind of 10 to 15 days shifting to the drier side. And that'll be important to watch given some of the heat that's expected here in the meantime. I do want to jump over and show you. We jump down here and look at the 6 to 10 day outlook for temperatures from the Climate Prediction Center. With that ridge re-expanding over the middle part of the country next week, you can see that signature outlined nicely from the CPC. Cooler over the western U.S. and California, which has been hot at times with some wildfire activity this year. I'm going to jump back and we're going to take that heat forecast and expand it out to the 8 to 14 day outlook. And you can kind of see that northwest flow and that ridging shifting more so over Canada take hold, with some of these cooler temperatures trying to push back as we turn the calendar month over to August. Now, precipitation-wise, it's going to look similar. Try it 6 to 10 days around that ridge riding pattern. So with that ridge kind of anchored here, even from Oregon, an area that's been dry this year, shifting all the way around, we'll see how we do in New England. And then with some of that tropical moisture kind of lingering in this area, some rainfall, just slightly above average probability sneaking back into the lower Mississippi River Valley. Jump over it and we'll take that out to the 8 to 14 day outlook from the CPC. They're a little bit less bullish on this corridor in here, so watching closely to see how much of this precipitation that we can get into Kansas and Oklahoma, maybe northern Arkansas, near the end of the forecast period, that kind of first week of August. But then now highlighting that area that I just mentioned, kind of I-80 toward New England for less precipitation chances as we get to the new month. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I have quite a bit of skepticism regarding where these modeled forecasts might be going in August, just given what we've seen summertime. They're typically the least accurate and they haven't been very accurate this year. And so really my focus is on this MJO activity that Eric mentioned yesterday, trying to get a hold of where that activity is going to be most prominent in August, and then unfold that into what we're expecting from the forecast, given kind of the background state, the Bermuda High, and the areas that are lacking in precipitation or have soil moisture deficits now. It's kind of those three things that we use to try to build where we're going with that August forecast. Now, critically, I'm going to start with the MJO because it's what's in some of these modeled forecasts rather nicely displayed here. This is looking at ascent in the upper levels of the atmosphere, using divergence as a proxy for that. We've shown this map quite a few times, but where we see these green colors, we can generally identify the MJO. So right now, over the next 5 days, if we take it out through the 26th, we're seeing the MJO kind of live in the Western Pacific, kind of near the Philippines, maybe stretching out here near Tahiti. And that makes sense. Phases kind of 5 and 6. As I take this forecast through the end of July, now into the first part of August, we've seen that MJO shift from this corridor here. Maybe remember that was where those green values were. It's now shifting to the east, more so over phases 7 and 8, kind of the Central Pacific or the Eastern Pacific. Now, the forecast model I'm showing you here, this is the ECMWF extended model. This is the one that has been going over dry with that anchored ridging over the middle part of the country. If I take this forecast into the second week of August, and now pushing toward the third, well, it's certainly not over phases 7 and 8 now. It's flipped all the way across the Atlantic over into Africa and the Indian Ocean, maybe phases 2 or 3. Take it through the end of August, the third and fourth week. Now it's in phases, 3 or 4 here over the Indian Ocean, maybe starting to get over the maritime continent, where we're seeing suppression and sinking airs here over the Eastern Pacific, even getting over towards Central America. So that is a full transit, and that's the big question mark I have. And frankly, I'm skeptical of this for a number of reasons from the ECMWF extended. And that means I'm skeptical of that large ridge forecast over the middle part of the country in August. Now, the ECMWF has not been performing well in the middle part of summer. Its accuracy typically starts to improve as we get closer toward fall. Is it going to suddenly flip that switch now in August? I don't know. I'll be honest with you, but I'm going to remain skeptical of it just given some of the other background states in the atmosphere. Now, if we look at that forecast on the phase diagram, we can see this is from that same ECMWF extended model, trying to push that MJO over into phases 2 and 3. It's hard to see with this spaghetti plot here, but you can kind of see generally it's trying to push that MJO in a pattern that looks like that over phases critically 2 and 3 as we get into August. Now, if we just look at the ECMWF model, this only takes us out to 10 days. We can see it inching along on that same path. So at least the near-term forecast is consistent with the long-term and that general motion. But my question is, and we can highlight here if we look at the Bureau of Meteorology from Australia, their forecast has this MJO getting stopped on phase 8. So instead of getting further out, maybe phase 1, 2, and 3, as we get further into the month of August, it's generally been pulling the MJO back to null space, maybe even bringing it back toward phases 5 and 6 again, more so over the Western Pacific. Now, the reason I bring that up is because we've seen that as a more plausible scenario this year. I mean, if you just think about where we've been over the last 30 days, the MJO has generally been over the far Western Pacific. That's been the kind of the area this summer where it has wanted to live. And if you think about, Eric talked about this yesterday, this kind of generally background La Nina state, well, that makes a lot of sense that it's been living over in that area in the Western Pacific. That's just generally where it tries to reside this time of year. Now, if we look at the ECMWF, Now, if I just jump over and look at the ECMWF ensemble, this only takes us out 15 days. I'm going to pull this out further here. We do see that MJO starting to move from west to east, right? That same pattern that we saw in the extended forecast, which took us all the way out through August. So we do get it into the central and eastern Pacific, again, phases 7 and 8 here. The question is this going to jump over further out into the Atlantic and then ultimately out into Africa and the Indian Ocean? That Bureau Meteorology forecast kind of had it hitting here, weakening, and then trying to push back here over the western Pacific, perhaps, as we get into August. That will lessen that chance, I would think, for widespread ridging over the middle part of the country, and then we'd assume drought and heat risk as well. Now, one reason I'm kind of saying this is because if we look at the past August that have been very dry, and this corridor here in the middle part of the country, it's called the corn and soybean belt, where we have seen that MJO and that divergence live in the upper atmosphere has generally been here over the Indian Ocean and kind of the western portion of the maritime continent and Indonesia. So it's been this corridor here. And that lines up pretty closely with that ECMWF extended forecast here. I'm going to show you. We'll take this forecast out into the middle part of August. Let's stop it here. This is August 17th through the 22nd. And these maps look very similar. So this phase is what, 3, 4, maybe getting over toward 5. Sinking motion here in the central and eastern Pacific. And if we jump and show you, this is 2013, 08, 99, 84, 83. These were years with very little precipitation in this area here. And that lines up very closely, right? There's that sinking motion in the central and eastern Pacific with the ECMWF extended forecast. But I'm skeptical of that forecast, right? I'm skeptical of that dry risk moving in, because we've generally seen the MJO try to live in this area this summer. So you're asking for a pretty big regime change from the atmosphere as we head into August. And I'm just not so sure that we're going to see this widespread area of drought development getting in next year. Could it happen? Yes, I mentioned that. But another piece to this, if I show you the latest forecast from the ECMWF ENS over the next 8 to 14 days, let's see where I put that. I mean, it's a quarter here where we're adding soil moisture. Think about the last 30 days of precipitation. I mean, this area here. So all that moisture in the ground here that we've seen, I mean, we just showed you thunderstorms over Kansas, over northern Missouri. We're going to include more precipitation coverage over this corridor over the next 7 and the next 14 days. I mean, you're just asking a lot of the atmosphere to then produce a lot of ridging over this corridor here. Now, could it be anchored here more so over the south where we're expecting this area to expand in dryness? Well, yeah. But I'm a little bit skeptical it's going to be one of these big dominant Midwest ridges or central U.S. ridges given what we've seen this year. Areas that I am concerned about just given the next 14 days, well, maybe here over New England, maybe the Northwest. We have seen some precipitation in here, but we're talking like, a half inch or a quarter inch, not a lot to widely sway those soil moistures, or maybe in the northwest part of Canada. But at least color me skeptical regarding some of these more dire August forecasts right now for the middle part of the country. Last thing I want to touch on is that MJO conversation and the tropics. So if we think about where the MJO is living now, we kind of mentioned this at the beginning of this video. Here's present day on the Hofmuller diagram. This is July 22nd. Again, I mentioned this summer. I mean, look all the way back to June 22nd. This has been where the MJO has wanted to live. So if you're going to shift it all the way over, the Indian Ocean this quarter here, you're asking for a pretty sizable regime change from the summer atmosphere pattern. We've seen that strong Bermuda high this year, which has come to save the day in terms of those reliable kind of precipitation chances despite some of the heat this year. I would expect that to continue in August without a more obvious shift. Again, we'll see how this forecast changes in the next 7 to 10 days. That's just kind of my opinion of where I see things right now. Now, this ECMWF AFS forecast does take us out to August 6th. We're seeing one of these kind of quick movements, maybe these Kelvin waves over the Atlantic Ocean, maybe trying to get over Africa here. And at least as it relates to that kind of hurricane forecast, as we get into August here and we shift some of that better ascent in the atmosphere over the Atlantic, I'm kind of looking at this area here of the map, into the early part of August, probably going to see an uptick in the National Hurricane Center identifying disturbances and some tropical convection in this area here. I'm not saying we're going to see widespread hurricane development because early August, not quite at that climatological peak that we get into later in the year. If we do see this MJO activity shift back here over the West Pacific and we return this descent over this area of the Atlantic as we get into late August and early September, kind of at the peak of the season, we're going to see this hurricane season lacking kind of at the peak, and that's going to bring down the averages at the end of the year. So at least this forecast right now shows early August with some potential favorability, and maybe late August less of that if some of these forecast thoughts hold true. I'll leave it there today. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all tomorrow.